second aspect of this overall 5 ways of strengthening the interagency coordination, the second way is to strengthen interagency cooperation between local law enforcement and the intelligence community. Right, so we want to be able to strengthen the relationship between local law enforcement and the intelligence community. So 2 is strengthen the relationship between local law enforcement and intelligence community. Right? Okay, so strengthen that relationship. That'll help. Section 107 expands on this idea, and these are the provisions in the Patriot Act. Here's a quote, "Provisions encourage the exchange of law enforcement and intelligence information were included in the U.S. Patriot Act, PL 107 through 156. So, you know, that's just reference blah, blah, blah for those of you who want to go out and do your own research, right? Expansion of regional information sharing systems to facilitate federal, state, local law enforcement response related to terrorist attacks, right? Remember, if it's the case that we're coordinating our information sharing and our interagency cooperations from our first responders, right? So that our first responders, our public health folk, our EMT specialists, our police, our fire chiefs, and blah, 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 blah. If there is a true sense, and we work from the bottom up, then there must be a sense that we go from the sharing of information from local law enforcement to the intelligence community. So obviously the next connection would be to the intelligence community. The second part, B, so this is 2B on page 25, 2B states, establishing and operating secure information sharing systems to enhance the investigation and prosecution abilities of participating enforcement agencies in addressing multi-jurisdictional terrorist conspiracies and activities, right? The reason why local law enforcement and intelligence communities need to have a very structured interagency coordination in order to facilitate this information sharing environment is because of this is what's key, right? This is what I think is key. T-I-J-U-R-I-S. Right? Multi-jurisdictions, right? When we're talking about jurisdictional territory, right? We're going to need, obviously, local law enforcement, and when I mean local law, like city cops, right? Their jurisdiction only gives them power within the jurisdiction, right? Terrorist organizations and terrorists aren't restricted to jurisdictions, right? They go where they want and they act how they want. So if you're attempting, and this is just obvious, right? If you're attempting to combat terrorism and you want, especially your first responders, to be able to react and proactively engage potential threats, well, we have to have a sense in which their participation can give us the intel so that members of the intelligence community, JTTF and blah, 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 can go about enforcing and utilizing this multi-jurisdictional power that they have, right? That multi-jurisdictional power, right, so the multi-jurisdictional power that FBI agent might have as opposed to a local law enforcement police officer, it's not that it's just that it's broader. It's that there needs to be a sense in which information can be shared between the local city cop and the Fed. The local city cop and, you know, not necessarily the commander-in-chief, let's be practical, but members at the federal level for, you know, any of the various members of the intelligence community, right? And I talked about sort of the architecture, right? I think it was NIEMs, right? National Information Exchange models, right? So there has to be a sense in which information can flow upward from the city cop and downward from the members of the intelligence community, right? So in order to strengthen this interagency approach, this attempt to coordinate, right? Remember, coordinate, I already said, but coordination is going to be key in this discussion. In order to facilitate this, we're going to have to make sure, it's absolutely essential, that local law enforcement can quickly assess and access and transfer information that they feel is potentially based on some directive or whatever, terrorist related. Okay. Number 3. Clearly define the roles and responsibilities of key federal agencies, right? Provided links from where I got this notion, right? Clearly define, and this is important, right? Clearly define the role and the responsibilities of key federal agencies. This goes back to what I said earlier with respect to overlap. You have to make sure that in a discussion of agencies, that we don't want agencies having similar overlap, right? If my mission is defined within this scope, and your mission is defined within this scope, then there's an overlap in mission. Part of my mission is covered by you. So what becomes problematic, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, luckily I don't have to make these decisions, is some of this fat needs to be trimmed. Right? Some of this fat needs to be trimmed. I don't know how you go about doing it. Whichever agency is historically been identified with that mission gets the mission, blah, 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 whatever. But the point is, first of all, it costs a lot of money for us to both have the same mission. We're both facilitating, and when it specifically function. Remember, I drew the picture earlier, the function. If my function and your function with respect to this point is exactly the same, it doesn't make sense having both of us, both of our agencies, unless it's, something I can't think of right now, right? But, I mean, just generally, it doesn't make sense that both of our agencies facilitate exactly the same function, right? One, it's a waste of money, so we can use that money to do something better. And 2, it creates redundancies and overlaps in the system. However, if it's the case that you want redundancies in the system, you want overlap for oversight, because obviously oversight, and I'll talk about this later, much later, and not in this section of the video, oversight is itself contingent on overlap, the idea of overlap, and I don't want to confuse you at this point, then fine. But other than that, there really shouldn't be any overlap between the agencies, right? So the second point is strengthening clearly defining the roles and responsibilities of key federal agencies, right? So we need to know what the role is, right? Clearly defined roles is very, very important. Information must be shared among federal agencies, and this is where I got the Homeland Security's Info Sharing Act, 6 USC 481, bureaucratic crap. Subtitle, Info Sharing, Section 891, short title, Finding and Sense of Congress. I'm not going to go through all of these, just the ones that I've highlighted. So, first, they're all important, but it's just the things that jumped out to me, right? Again, we're talking about creating a state of affairs where we can truly talk about interagency coordination. And as we saw maybe a few minutes ago, 15, 20 minutes ago, my argument is that we can take this notion of interagency cooperation and embed it in the human body. And I talked about how to do that, right? Because that's really, it's more than just moving furniture. It's more than you just walking a week in my shoes. It's no, you went through exactly the same, the same requirements, the same training that produces agents for another agency, right? So insofar as you've gone through that training, you have essentially become an agent for another agency. It's paradoxical in a sense, but I think it's actually pretty genius. Number 2, the federal government relies on state and local personnel to protect against terrorist attacks, right? This is what we're saying, right? It's not just a federal government, sort of, we have the feds here, we have the local here, and then we have sort of these regional clearinghouses, as I'm calling it. Information needs to go up, and it needs to come right back down, right? There needs to be communication between LLEs and SLTTs, state and local, territorial, tribal. That information needs to go to JTTF and THS, FCs, and to the bigwigs and back down. Right. So this is the chain, the flow, and that information has to be shared. Right. It says information must be shared. The federal government relies, so in subtitle 1, section 891, part 2, the federal